Right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our final DEI Knowledge Exchange webinar for 2023. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session. My name is Paul Modley, and I'm the Managing Director for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for AMS. And I've got the pleasure of co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Judy Ellis, who you can see on the screen. I'll shortly be handing across to Judy as she's going to be kind of running with the main part of the session today. But I just wanted to kind of set the scene. This is as I say, the third of our webinars this year. The topic for this one is Beyond Race and Ethnicity. How have organizations progressed in the last 3 years? I'm hoping that with our stellar panel, we're going to get into a really great conversation around what's happened over the last 3 years. We've seen a lot of investment made by organizations in race, ethnicity, equity drive. We've seen a lot of investment in new chief diversity officers and lots of initiatives. So it'd be really good to kind of get under the skin and really understand how we feel about the progress that has been made over the last 3 years. We would like this session to be as participative as we can. You'll notice on the panel, there is an opportunity for the audience, to submit some questions, comments as we go through. Unlikely we'll have the time to address every question that comes through, but please be assured that we will respond to them after the call and we will provide a written response. I will be keeping an eye on that and feeding them in as we go through the process. I'll also keep an eye on the time. I want to make sure that we finish promptly because I know many of you will have meetings to go on to, or if it's evening time, Christmas parties, holiday parties, etc. So I will be keeping an eye on the time. So enough from me. Let me hand across to Judy.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, I'm Judy Ellis, and I'm the head of our Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory practice at AMS. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today with a very esteemed panel who I would like to introduce each of you to. So panelists, I will give your name and affiliations and then just have you each give a brief hello before I come to you with questions. And first, I'd like to introduce Trevor Phillips, who's chair of Change the Race Ratio.
Good afternoon, Judy, or good morning, depending where you are.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Karima Green, who's Global Director of Inclusion and Impact with CSM Sports and Entertainment.
Thank you, Judy. It's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Next, I'll introduce Sherika Ekpo, who's a CHRO at Doc to Doc Lending.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am excited to be here and look forward to a very fruitful conversation.
And I'd like to introduce our final panelist, Holly Turner, who's Director of Supplier Diversity and Sustainability for Humana.
Hello, I'm very excited to be here and to have this discussion with you all.
Thank you, Holly. You know, as we've said, organizations around the world really made public commitments around race and ethnicity as part of their diversity and inclusion and equity strategy, as well as promises of new investment. And while some have been able to measure progress, others have experienced poor outcomes. And I'm interested in hearing from each of you panelists, and I'll start with you, Trevor. Do you believe employers have made the necessary progress in addressing race and ethnic disparities over the past years, considering the heightened global awareness around the issue?
Thanks, Judy. Well, look, I think that the answer to the question is probably not. That's not to decry the efforts that have been made, and I think we should never say that the fact that somebody hasn't succeeded doesn't mean that they shouldn't have tried. I think there are a couple of things that I would say. As you say, there's been heightened global awareness. Question number one, why have people bothered? have they bothered because and done things which are in relation to, for example, training or data keeping or telling their internal stories in order to show that they're doing something, or because they want to change something? And I think that the truth of the matter is that a lot of organizations were slightly panicked into some flag waving. I'm not entirely against flag waving, by the way. I think that sometimes even though you might look at what somebody's done, the program they put on, and say, well, look, that's not going to work that's not going to go very far. It's better they do something than they do nothing. So number one, I think that the question that one might ask is, have people done what they're doing for the right reasons? Well, sometimes not, but the fact they've done something matters. But what then you have to ask yourself is, are they choosing some paths that are going to be effective? And here, I think we do have to make a distinction between different jurisprudence. For example, in the United States, there's legislation, excuse me, which allows affirmative action. Here in the United Kingdom, that's not possible. So some of the pathways that one might choose to pursue, you can't. In the United States, there's mandatory reporting to the EEOC. Here, there isn't, certainly not in relation to race. So the context is different. The third thing that has made a difference, I think, and this has generally been if you like, a tailwind for diversity, is that the demographics are changing. Our census came out last year, and we pretty much leapt from a population that was about 14% minority to something a little north of 20% in 10 years. The numbers, I don't think, have changed quite as dramatically in the United States, but they are changing. And that, I think, is changing people's minds about what they need to do, particularly given that there's a pretty tight labor market. The last thing I think that we ought to be thinking about is, when we look around at what people have done, what lessons can we take? Well, I think one is that there are some things which were very fashionable, which I think, I wouldn't say have failed. Let's say, for example, unconscious bias. I don't think it's failed, but I think people's expectations of what unconscious bias programs would do have been disappointed. And I think it's quite important to get that in context, because if we don't really understand why something hasn't delivered what we had expected, then the tendency is to then start throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying that we can't really do anything very much about this. So I think some proper analysis with data and science will make a difference. And the last thing I guess I'd like to say, which perhaps we might return to in this conversation, is that I think we're beginning to understand, particularly when it comes to race, which is a very difficult conversation, I think, certainly on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think elsewhere in the world, particularly on the European continent, that we need to talk more and talk more openly about differences and the impact of race, and not just deficits. I think we need to talk a little bit more about what different people of different backgrounds might bring positively. So in our country, in the United Kingdom, some minority groups are on average way better, have higher educational attainment than the average, and they will bring something special to the workforce. And we don't fully understand why, because we haven't studied it properly. And I think we need to start thinking a little bit more positively, not just about how we fix the deficits, but how we take advantage of the new things that people from different backgrounds might bring into the workplace.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And as you said, that's the real crux of diversity, that we all have differences and we all have great assets that we can bring to each other. Sherika, I'd like to come to you. What would you say regarding progress that has been made over the past 3 years?
Thanks, Judy. I agree with Trevor wholeheartedly. I think that there has been some progress, but perhaps the expectations were off to begin with. When there was a racial reckoning a health crisis globally, companies panicked, and there was an expectation that companies would shift their focus, right, from their business to now focusing more on some social issues. And while that is the case for certain companies, or more importantly, certain industries, a lot of companies were not comfortable with that. And so there was some of that flag waving because there was pressure from employees to react, to respond. And many leadership teams were not ready for that pressure. So I'm going to get tactical for a bit, because I do think, especially in the US, we did see an increase of diversity and inclusion councils, for instance, right? Many companies said, hey, let's get this group of employees together so that we can understand how people are feeling. We saw an increase of listening sessions. We saw an increase of candid conversations, like all of the things. But then that was it. And so it was just a lot of talk in some cases. And so I think the companies that have actually shown quantitative and qualitative progress were those that set objective goals that actually tie back to their business, to their customers, to their outcomes, and things that they were able to measure. So, right, listen, I do think that there was a lot of good done in those conversations because it heightened the awareness. And it began to build the trust that in some cases did not exist between employees and senior leaders. However, we have a long way to go, right? Employee engagement is not enough. We actually have to see action. We have to actually create transparency around the progress. I think it's okay to say we had a goal of 30% women leaders at the director or above level, and we have not yet met that goal. That is an example of a goal of a company that I've consulted for. But if you haven't met it, that's okay. What I think we need to do is do exactly what Trevor mentioned, which is celebrate differences. And I think I see a lot of companies moving away from diversity, equity, and inclusion and adding on that B for belonging, because that belonging is where we allow people to actually share their differences and look at different groups and value them for their unique contributions.
Thank you for that. And you're right. And having that belonging quotient, so to speak, measured is something that I'm beginning to see more and more of our clients starting to look to. I'm interested in hearing your perspective, Karima, especially with your background. Would love to hear your perspective on progress or what's happened since the last 3 years, what you've seen happening.
Thank you, Judy. And sort of echoing Trevor and Sherika, it's not to negate the efforts made thus far because it's been important, but I think that we need to be honest and open with each other in this work, that it still feels performative. And I think that we need to address some of the systemic challenges that exist within our society. So, for example, mandating the reporting that we see in places like the US with EEOC, or the gender pay gap reporting in the UK, in order for us to really start to challenge, to measure those progress, to close those equity gaps, we need our governments to support and mandate that for organisations to be responsible businesses and ensuring that their practices are rooted in that data. And there are many organisations that do it, but I do believe that we should be mandating those policies. And I think secondly, the other piece is really acknowledging that there remains a discomfort around discussing race and racial issues and racism within the workplace. And I think that sometimes limits progress. And for me, I truly believe in a focus of strand within your inclusion strategy that is centered around anti-racism. So there's one thing around celebrating cultural difference and driving forward those policies and processes, but also being very clear in your organisational stance around anti-racism as a business and the avenues in which you are expected as an employee to report if you witness it. That's what we're seeing a lot. Either you're experiencing or you're witnessing it, and people very often don't come forth because there's still a fear-based culture in speaking out and being an ally in that moment. So for me, it absolutely is rooted in support around a governmental policy, around equity, but also organisational firm stance and willingness to create consequence when employees or moments within an organisation that are misaligned to their beliefs in anti-racism, which is what we need in order to really progress this work.
Thank you for that perspective. It's interesting, as I was working with a client in the last month who actually said, we don't want to talk about racism. And it was kind of shocking to hear them say overtly, like, let's do DEI, but not actually speak to that specific issue. And requiring, as you said, globally, there are much more requirements around transparency. So continuing to see that move in driving that openness to see what's actually happening in the inside of an organization versus what is going out in comms is important. Holly, from your perspective in supplier diversity, I'm really interested in hearing from you about what you've seen really happen or change in the last 3 years.
So I would mention that I agree with everything that everyone said previously. In fact, they went into so much detail. I'm not sure how much more I have to add. I will say that it used to be taboo to talk about some of the things that we're talking about in corporations now. So politics is now a lot more open than ever before. Race is a lot more open than ever before. I think that when we talk about geographically in the U.S., that there is a lot of racial tension just across the U.S. The current state is challenging and forcing companies to respond. So like when we had the civil unrest, you saw a lot of corporations jump right in and start adding all these diversity, equity, and inclusion jobs and hiring from a chief diversity officer standpoint. But then once it toned down, those that may not have been as committed, those were the first corporations to cut those roles. So have we done enough? Definitely not. But to Trevor's point and Sherika's point, I wouldn't take away from the progress that we have made, because we have to start somewhere. That old saying, whatever gets you to church, eventually you'll get saved. You just got to get there. So whatever gets us there, to start addressing some of the issues. I like what Sherika said about corporations incorporating belonging. Even if that isn't part of the title, a lot of corporations like Humana is doing a really good job, and I'm seeing a lot of other corporations do a really good job of celebrating all different cultures and nationalities. And that's a step in the right direction, but is there more to do? Absolutely. Absolutely, there's more to do. They wouldn't need us, and whether they know they need us or not, they still do. And traction from an intentionality, I use that term all the time. So I report into procurement, lead our supplier diversity and sustainability, as I mentioned, but I have a dotted line reporting structure into our diversity, equity, and inclusion team. So it's really like I'm on two teams, and it's beneficial because there is an intersection with with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and with our ESG efforts, and with supplier diversity, which kind of sits within all of that. And from both a supplier standpoint and a workforce standpoint, there is still a lot of work to be done, a lot of intentional work to be done. And I can't remember who said it, but a lot of transparency on where we need to go. I think just seeing where we are, being honest about where we are today in each corporation, and then you can truly see, here is the path on how we move forward. It's going to be uncomfortable, but don't we always say that when you're uncomfortable, there's growth there? And I think that there's a lot of opportunity.
That's great. Picking up on that transparency strand, Sherika, you've really emphasized the importance of leaders really understanding the employee experience of individuals from underrepresented ethnic identities. I'd be interested in having you elaborate on that. What kind of insight can really be gained through understanding both the qualitative and quantitative aspects of those employees and their experiences?
Yes, Judy, thanks for that question. Right, everyone has a story. So everyone listening to this webinar today has a story, right? And can I just stop and say and appreciate the diversity on this call? The number of industries represented, the number of countries represented, the number of races, genders. I was impressed when I saw the list yesterday. I digress, but let's just say everyone has a story, and those lived experiences generally come out in the way that we behave and interact with others. For a very long time, for many companies and some newer times for other companies, senior leaders are really focused more on employee experience. So we see all of these employee engagement surveys that are coming out, and many of them have a quantitative and qualitative aspect to it. Well, one of the things I have appreciated about my leaders, whether it was at Google or Anaplan or even Doc Lending, is that they read the qualitative comments. Okay, they want to understand the lived experiences of the employees. And I think that's extremely important because that belonging quotient that you mentioned, Judy, or the inclusion index, or whatever the index name is at your respective company, only tells part of the story. And it only generally tells the part of the story that is related to the majority. So one of the things that I really appreciated, I spent some time at Google in the diversity and inclusion space, and we spent a lot of time on their employee engagement survey, which was called Google Geist. And in that, yes, you would look at all of the general, comments and indices, but we spent a vast amount of time looking at the data from an intersectional perspective, because what we realized is that non-binary men, women, trans individuals, Black, white, Latina, Asian, whatever it is, all experience the workplace differently, irrespective of what that inclusion index said. And when we actually separated the data and looked at it from different vantage points, we found that employees were experiencing the organization, almost in a 180 form. Right. And so I think those, looking at that data and really looking at the intersection of that data will allow us to, as practitioners, to start asking the right questions. What systems do we need to change? How can we ensure a consistent experience across the board? And I often ask my leaders, I do a lot of coaching with executive leaders, and I ask them, what do we need to challenge, change, or create? And many times the quantitative and qualitative data gives you the answers to those questions if you're just willing to read and or listen.
I think that's so important. And in the work that I do, we often see one factor is that retention or attrition is much more significant for people of color than for the majority of the population. And you've described during your time at Google that they had kind of a retention department that was really effective to help managers, even with employees before they left, those that were at risk of leaving. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the strategies employed by that department and how it helped?
Absolutely. This was ahead of the social unrest in 2020, right? And so there was a group of what we call retention specialists, and it was a really thoughtful group in terms of not only what employees we supported, but where that support would come from. Because what we realized is that while employees were historically underrepresented employees were having a different experience, oftentimes, when employees decide to leave, they're generally leaving their manager, not the company. And so we realized that upskilling the managers was one of the first areas that we needed to focus on. And so a part of that retention group was, yes, to work with the HR business partners, to work with the leaders to say, how is Sherika doing? How is Karima doing? Is she at risk? And by the way, regardless of our skin color, right? Karima and I were both underrepresented in that space because in tech, we still lag behind when we're looking at representation from women, right? So we would actually have to ask ourselves, what is it that we can do to support Karima and Sherika? First, that started with identification of those that may be at risk. And a lot of times we would look at performance reviews. We would look at their Google Guys survey, the groups that they were in, because the surveys are anonymous, but you can actually look at, departments and data that way. But we would also, do listening sessions and actually go through the ERG groups that we had to really understand some of those lived experiences as well. And when I tell you a retention specialist would then reach out to the employee to have one-on-one coaching conversations to understand what was working well and what wasn't, the first line of sight was not to say, I'm out the door. It was, will a shift in manager help? Are you in the right job series? How about a special assignment to get you the skills that you need to be successful on your overall project? There was just a willingness to really dissect the situation and offer resources before people left. Because as everyone on this call knows, it takes a lot of money, time, and resources to recruit quality and top talent. And while we're in this war, we have to retain the people that we have invested so much into over the years and ensure that they are having the best experience so that we can continue to grow our employees from within.
I love that really concerted effort to troubleshoot and get actively engaged with both the manager and the employee, not just treating the employee as a problem, so to speak, but getting to the root cause and helping the manager in that case too. Karima, I'd like to come to you. You've talked about intersectionality, socioeconomic and social impact strategies that have helped to deliver change in the race, ethnicity, equity area. Can you explain more about what you mean by this?
Absolutely, thanks. And just to sort of echo what Sherika was saying in terms of an intersectional approach, which I think is critical in terms of understanding and identifying the different verticals, but we can't look at these in a complete vacuum, because I don't think it allows us to identify the root operationally of what those challenges are experienced by those individuals. And so, we need that to be able to make the right interventions and the right long-term changes. And I think, again, to sort of pin back to what I said in the opening statement, for me, it's really around creating equity. So it's identifying what these series of barriers are. And I work in sports, so I talk a lot in sports analogies. So it's about what do we do to create an even playing field and address those different areas. And I think in terms of social impact measures, it's really identifying a two-pronged approach. So the first really is looking at your operational business practices once more, understanding your procurement process, the types of suppliers that you work with. If you really want to close equity and wealth gaps, improving socio mobility and closing wealth gaps in different ethnic minority backgrounds, we need to be looking at spending money with different businesses, and the UK in particular has really effective resources that you can tap into, where you can look at diverse owned businesses, for example, and so organizations can be much more mindful and meaningful about the types of businesses that they work with to become much more ethical part of the supply chain, which I think is really important. I think socially, in terms of the people side, there is certainly opportunity to work with specific community partnerships, charities, non-profit organizations. Firstly, you can support from a fiscal perception in terms of providing monetary donations or donations in kind in terms of volunteer hours, in which you can expand or broaden those people involved with those charities, their horizons. So CSM, we are a sports agency. It's our passion, it's our love. We work with two really incredible organizations in the UK. The first called Switch to Play, which supports professional athletes who are coming to the end of their careers into finding roles in the wider sporting ecosystem to ensure that access is still available to them. So they come and spend a lot of time with us at the agency, and we talk them through all the different roles that are involved in the sports ecosystem. And then secondly, Football Beyond Borders, which is just a wonderful organisation that is focused on supporting teenagers who might be disengaged in school but really passionate about sports and football in particular. And it's about providing them with the support to transition them through the end of their schooling and into adulthood by giving them experiences and allowing them to see the world of football, the roles that are involved in that industry. And so we have supported that organisation a lot. And I think it's really key, because that is essentially a new talent pool that we can start to cultivate in terms of succession pipeline, sourcing, as well as, you know, leaving a legacy of positive impact onto communities. And Football Beyond Borders are specifically focused on partnering with areas and schools from socioeconomic disadvantage. So a majority of these individuals come from different ethnic backgrounds. And so I think, you know, addressing that intersectionality through those three layers, operationally, socially, and then through the work of volunteering and community partnerships, is a really great way of moving this piece forward.
Thank you. Those are some really great ways to plug in and make a meaningful difference. And, you know, we've referenced that there's not always been meaningful difference made over the past few years. And you have even referenced the rise and fall of DEI professionals, which has had an impact on progress. Can you explain what you've seen in that space and what meaning you've taken from that?
Yeah, thank you. So absolutely, I think since 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, where the whole world was jolted into consciousness about the issues, and organisations were beginning to be held to account in a way that they'd never been before, we absolutely saw a rise in this discipline in terms of individuals being brought into organisations in a much more strategic way, right? With that, there was a huge amount of expectation and demand versus, I think, what has been the reality to be able to deliver. And one thing that I've really noticed over the last couple of years is that DEI or inclusion professionals don't have the luxury of time. So if we think about the progress that we've made in 3 years, we're talking about effectively changing society. And so, you know, in doing so, you know, you're expected to come in and snap your fingers and the whole organization's diversified. But of course, that's incredibly difficult, especially if you want to fix the operational root causes that are going on. You know, hiring in talent is one thing. To Sherika's point, retaining that talent is a completely different skill in itself. And I think that, you know, what we're seeing is there is a skewed accountability for those inclusion professionals there in terms of what they can really drive forward. And so there's a concept that I have developed over the last couple of years in terms of being able to manage expectations across workforces and to work with leadership to truly demonstrate how change and how long change can take. So there's immediate culture, which is something that you can affect pretty much from day one. That's all about inclusion. So it's the stuff that you see, feel, hear every day. It's belonging in its core, right? And then there's significant culture, and that's the organizational practice, policy, process, diversifying the business that can take up to 5 to 7 years, especially for industries in which the talent pipeline is very reduced. And so actually you're spending an enormous amount of time cultivating that talent into the industry. And I think in terms of the rise and fall of the inclusion professional, you know, we're certainly seeing a worrying amount of turnover in very high profile organizations in chief level roles, and you question as to whether or not those individuals were brought in a way that was performative. And so there has been some comments that those roles have felt toothless in terms of not being able to influence or affect the change that's required. And you have to wonder what that does for the organization itself in terms of seeing that turnover, the hindrance of the progress that can make, because ultimately you bring someone else in, it takes them 6 months to get involved in that organization and then rebuild, and so that slows it down. And then I think the other piece really is, you know, the burnout of inclusion professionals over the last couple of years in particular. And one thing that I will say is that in this role, sometimes your resilience has to outweigh your skills, and I think, you know, we have to really really be present and able to absorb a lot of trauma on a day-to-day basis. And I think many of us who work in this space, we don't have a lot of resource, we don't often have a lot of investment, but we have an enormous amount of expectation upon us. And very often, you know, we are from and we represent the communities that we speak on behalf. I'm a Middle Eastern woman. The past couple of weeks have been some of the most difficult in my career, and I think that, you know, it's incredibly challenging in terms of when you are not able to create influence or move things forward in this space professionally. It's frustrating. Personally, it can be devastating, and that's, I think, sometimes the fine line that inclusion professionals tread, and perhaps why we're seeing an exit of inclusion professionals over the last 12 months in particular, which is what I worry for, because we are needed, and, you know, in order to move this forward, we have to be a key, critical, strategic part of the organisation that has a voice and has a seat at the table.
Thank you, Karima. I think that's so important, that for many of us, part of our identity is part of what gives both the passion to be involved, but also, as you said, brings that that skill set numbingness when you see what's happening to your own community. I appreciate you sharing your Middle Eastern heritage with us as well. When I come to you, Trevor, I'd really like to hear more about what the purpose of Change the Race ratio is and how it's really helped to drive change in ethnicity and equity in the UK in the last couple of years, with you serving as chair.
Full disclosure, I've only recently taken over as chair, and I'll explain a little bit about what that's about in a second. But I'm enjoying hearing the passion and, you know, the stories. And I think that's, in a way, part of what we all have to do. We have to have the conversation openly, because one of the things that I'm constantly thinking in my old role, which I did, you know, before dawn of time, as chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I had to deal with enforcing the equality legislation across all of our 9 protected grounds. It's interesting that when it comes to, for example, leadership in the corporate sector, we've made quite big strides on gender and so on. And more importantly, the conversation about gender in corporate sector is more open. Nobody's embarrassed, nobody's afraid. When it comes to race, you know, at this point, I've said that sentence, you can feel the boardroom freezing because everybody's terrified. And I think I've got a simple hypothesis about this. Most of us at one point or another will become old, so we're not so worried, if we're lucky, we're not so worried about the whole issue of age. Nobody's scared about that. We might be disabled. We can imagine having a different sexual orientation, and, you know, all of us in some way have an intimate relationship with somebody of a different sex. You know, even, believe it or not, I had a mother, I've got 5 sisters and so on. But the one line which is quite difficult is race and ethnicity, because by and large, we're never going to become that other thing. And I think for many people, that line, or beyond that line, is a foreign country that lies behind an opaque curtain. And that's partly why it's so scary. I think it's slightly different in the United States than it is here, but I think it is still the case that the issue of race is very, very difficult to have a conversation about. And that's partly what my predecessor as chair of this campaign, Change the Race Ratio, set out to do. He was president of our big business lobby, the Confederation of British Industry, a guy called Karen Bilaboria, who created basically a beer company. And he is of Indian extraction, Indian heritage. And Karen said, I'm not going to leave this role as president of the CBI, which is a voluntary role, and it's a trade association, without trying to do something about the fact we have so few people from minorities in the leadership of our big companies particularly. So he set up this campaign to try to essentially ginger people up, a bit like 30% Club. What we've decided to do with Change the Race Ratio is, first of all, give people the opportunity to get particularly top leaders, chairs, CEOs, senior independent directors, to give them a space where they can talk without feeling that they're going to be chopped down about race. So they can socialize it in a sense and be a bit more relaxed. Secondly, we want to provide a space in which people can talk about what is important, what are the right targets, what works, what doesn't work, and to also talk about things that fail. Because I think all of us here know that there are lots of things that people try and they don't work. But of course, it's very difficult sometimes in the corporate sector to say, I've tried this, I've chucked away, $25 million, but at least we now know that thing doesn't work, right? So we want to try and provide a space where that is. And thirdly, we're going to try to provide a market, because often, if I run, I run analytics company, what we do is we count. We're really good at counting. We're not so great at emotional intelligence. But what we might need is to find a partner that can help us understand what you need to do with that. And at the moment here, we don't really have a space or a market by which we can go and find, let's say, a behavioral science company that understands what to do when it comes to the EQ side of things in solving problems. So the third thing we want to try and do with Change the Race Ratio is provide a kind of a marketplace where you can find a partner. And our relationship is with what we here call, there's a government-backed organization called the Parker Review Committee, which is something I've been involved in since, 10 or 15, gosh, I'm old. But we've really tried, the point is that Parker it's government-backed, and the aim was originally to get at least one person of color on every FTSE 100 company, the equivalent for Americans of a S&P 500, which we managed to do just about 6 months ago. We hit the target. We've now expanded it to our top 250, and the 350, and the 50 private companies, biggest private companies. We're coming after you too. So, but the important thing, to answer your main point, Judy, is that in the company that I chair, the executive recruitment company I chair, Green Park, we have our aim is to be the best recruitment company. That's where we start. But what we try to do is to get people to understand that opening their minds to diversity helps them with their main purpose, which is to get the best people to do the best jobs. We provide a bigger pool. And so, what we're, I guess, famous for is last year, more than 50% of our 450 thereabouts people in top jobs were female. About a third of them were ethnic minorities. And we think people come back to us because they know they're getting a better deal, basically. They're getting better people for less. And the real point I want to make about that is that all of this we're talking about isn't just a social justice thing. It should always be about serving the organization's central purpose better, because that's how things become sustainable. If your business is to make money, diversity and inclusion has to help you make money. And that's what we try to do.
You've talked about a number of things, especially based on your background in the private sector, as well as what you've done with Change the Race Ratio. I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on how or what organizations need to do to prioritize race and ethnicity further to really deliver more change in the future.
Okay, well, I'll just say one thing, because I've probably talked too much already, but big thing, be simple. Don't make it complicated. Don't make it frightening, because that's one of the things that happens, because everybody gets paralyzed And what you end up with is people doing nothing. So, for example, in our company, we've got a very simple way to deal with some of this issue. We have what we call Green Park Rule, which is about how decisions get made. And our rule is that no decision that affects more than 1% of turnover, which means big hirings or investments, can be made in a room which is not diverse. There's at least got to be one person of color. There's got to be one person who is not the majority sex in the room. Otherwise, that decision's got to be reported up to the board, and the board then asks stupid questions like, why? And nobody needs that, because then it ends up on your appraisal and stuff like that. And it's interesting, over the last 3 years, we haven't had a single such report come up to the board, because a habit now is look around the room and before you make the big decision. And in that, the consequence of that is that literally we suck people up the chain of decision making to make sure it's diverse. And the consequence of that is that everybody in the company knows that it's okay to have diverse people in leadership, and that there's a kind of internal pressure for diversity right up the tree. It's a really simple thing that's had quite big effect in our company. Now, for another company, there'll be a different lever to pull. But I think my simple advice would be, think about what you want to do. Find a really simple lever that everybody can understand, that doesn't get in the way of the actual business, and that everybody can actually do. Because it's not that hard, in our case, just to have the right people in the room. I mean, you can then, people can then game the system and say, let's get the intern because she happens to be female. But, I think in our company, the culture is such that if you try to do that, somebody's going to look at you funny. But so that might be my answer. Work out what it is you really want to do, make it simple, find a simple lever and pull it.
Thank you. Very succinct and yet very difficult to do something that sounds that simple. Working on the right problem and knowing that you are, but having the right people seated at the table. One of my coaches early on in my career in this space said, who is going to be impacted by this policy or decision? Get some of those people in early on to help with the solutioning. So I appreciate that. And Holly, I think in your work with coaching business professionals from underrepresented backgrounds, you've really seen that. But before I come to that question with you, maybe we could start with you just talking about, as a supplier diversity professional, what have you seen in terms of U.S. organizations' financial commitments to diverse and small businesses? And what do you think is really driving whatever trend you're seeing? And how can businesses gain, like Humana, from investing in supplier diversity? That's a lot of questions I threw at you.
No, that's okay. That's okay. One, I just really, again, appreciate all of the different perspectives in this panel discussion and all of the sharing that is coming about. I mean, I'm learning just a lot, just, different lenses, different viewpoints from both in the US and the UK. And just as was mentioned before, to kind of get the best people for the best job, the best suppliers for the best price, and are able to be scalable to bring that level of diversity within to help companies grow. So basically, I believe that right now the financial investment is, everyone is figuring out, it's not just the smart business strategy. It is, it's not just the right thing to do, it's a smart business strategy. And is not just because of compliance, although compliance is checked in certain areas like in government sectors, but it's bringing diverse suppliers bring a level of connections, a different level of flexibility and innovation that generates bottom line growth. And I think companies are starting to realize that. At Humana, we're able to increase some of our market share by utilizing diverse suppliers as we go out and solicit for business. It's positive brand recognition for corporations to do that. Very, very similar to what Trevor was discussing as far as private sector, public sectors are having those same situations. In fact, private may be a little bit more robust than public, but everyone is getting there. But as I mentioned before, having diversity in this space with both workforce and suppliers generates bottom line growth because you have a different level of diversity of thought. People want to do business with companies that are reflective of the communities that they serve, with companies that look like the people that look like you, So some of the ways that I mentioned earlier in the conversation that there are clear intersections with DE&I and ESG. In fact, supplier diversity can be a catalyst for broader diversity and inclusion efforts within an organization. So with that, different ways that we can grow. You can grow as a corporation. Speaking from a supplier diversity standpoint, some of the things that we do is we're encouraging our supplier base and engaging our supplier base to be more inclusive by utilizing more diverse suppliers to service Humana. And one way of capturing that from a data perspective is by capturing that indirect spend reporting, which is sometimes referred to as Tier 2, by incorporating it into KPIs or business reviews, just having those conversations, even if a company is not there. I had a call this morning speaking to a company that doesn't have a supplier diversity department, but is growing into those efforts. So I offered my services to a supplier that is not diverse, even to say, how can I help from a coaching standpoint to build up your diversity program? I have built from ground up, and is the great thing about supplier diversity in particular is that it's non-threatening. A lot of corporations, even competitors, share best practices because everyone is trying to evolve in this space. In our competitive bids, we're asking, we're including at least one diverse supplier in all of our competitive bids, so in our sourcing efforts, but we are also encouraging those that are non-diverse to, as I mentioned before, work with diverse suppliers. We're asking the questions from an engagement standpoint. How diverse is your workforce? What does it look like? Does that mean that we're not going to do business with a particular supplier? Absolutely not. But just being a lot more intentional in our diversity efforts, not only in-house, but externally with the suppliers that we work with and with the communities that we serve. So I think another part of your question is some of the coaching and mentoring that we do within our organization, which is near and dear to my heart. We started roughly 5 years ago, maybe 4.5 years ago. We started a mentor protege program in-house to ensure that we were able to capture all of the diverse classifications that we have within, that we count, if you will, within our organization, which is pretty much everything. So from a minority business to small business, LGBT, veteran-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, etc. Hub Zone, we just recently added Hub Zone as well. So we kept it in-house instead of outsourcing that program to maybe another certifying organization or another organization so that it could be a little bit more inclusive. And what it looks like is it's a 12-month program where we, through referrals, and actually suppliers that I've met out in the marketplace. We evaluate who would be a benefit from our mentor protege program, who is interested and committed to being a part of this 12-month program where we have our senior leaders that are tied into it and willing to be mentors to these diverse businesses that we bring in. So it does a lot of things. It gives supplier diversity more exposure, both internally and externally. From a executive leadership standpoint, it builds up more advocacy for support and even understanding, an educational understanding of how to work better with a small and diverse business, and to be a lot more intentional about including diverse suppliers versus suppliers that we've always worked with. So there's a change management standpoint there. And, I mentioned that we added it into our sourcing and category strategy, but just further integrated into the business. That's where we're trying to get to. Truly integrating, where it's not just a supplier diversity team initiative or diversity team initiative. It's built into the thread of the way that we do business. And we have a ways to go. Our mentor protege program is a proactive program that is built to establish relationships with Humana and other diverse and small businesses. It's reciprocal. As I mentioned before, there are benefits from our senior leaders as well as benefits to the diverse supplier in learning some of the processes and procedures that we have in place that they may be able to not necessarily duplicate and do it the way that Humana does it, but take bits and pieces of it and incorporate it into their own. Or even if it's bigger really than Humana, it's about how to do business with any corporation, any business, and we're promoting a lot of B2B within the programs. So every other month, these selected suppliers, which it is kept small on purpose for intimate interaction and looking for true opportunities, both within Humana and actually from a coaching standpoint outside of Humana, however I can help to grow these suppliers. So every other month they meet with senior leader that they have been paired with, and they have one-on-ones with that senior leader. On the alternating month, then they are meeting in what we call our group sessions. And within those group sessions, we have, over the course of that year, we have different business segments come in. So starting with procurement, we come in and we talk about, here is how we procure. This is what it looks like. This are the policies and procedures that we have in place. And some things we have tweaked just based on what we've learned from the experiences of diverse and small businesses. Other things, they have taken some aha moments on how to approach a corporation the size of Humana, but then there's also that B2B connection. So those suppliers, as they're sharing their capabilities and working on their pitch and talking about their businesses, then they're also starting to do business with each other. And that's what supplier diversity is all about. The 360, we talk about goals and we talk about data, but it is about reinvesting in the communities that we all love and care about, that we all work in, that we all live in. And it does a 360 so that when we're able to invest and grow those diverse and small businesses, then they're growing themselves. And we're actually working on some market research to better show the economic impact of incorporating some of these diverse suppliers. We're constantly showing, pulling success stories that we can share both internally and externally, because we're still showing the business case on here is why there is a concerted effort in diversity as a whole, working with diverse suppliers, incorporating more diversity in the workforce, and what it looks like even within the supplier base that we are working with. How diverse is their workforce? How have we been able to engage and reinforce the importance of that as we rebuild our communities from not only the civil unrest, but also from the natural disasters. The U.S. has gone through a tremendous amount of change over the course of the last several years. And how do we rebuild that? And one way of rebuilding that is, like we talked about before, belonging, that level of intentionality, that level of transparency and diversity of mind.
I need to interrupt. I realize we're at time and we're probably going to lose a lot of our participants, but I appreciate so much you sharing what you're doing, the concerted efforts you're making, and really helping with the economic opportunities for people from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds. And I just want to close by thanking each one of you panelists. It's incredibly enriching to learn from you, both the experiences that have gone well and those things we can improve. And I thank all of our audience for attending today's webinar. And I would ask that once you leave the webinar, if you'd answer a brief survey that you'll be presented, and we'd appreciate hearing your feedback as we plan for next year. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours that has a link to view a recording of today's webinar. The recording of all 3 of our 2023 webinars are available in our DEI Knowledge Exchange mini site, and you can see a link to that site in the chat box now. So feel free to watch the recordings if you haven't done so, and please stay tuned for next year's webinar dates so that you can participate with us again. We'll update those on our mini site later this year and look forward to joining you next year for what will be much more thought-provoking discussion with HR and DEI professionals. So thank you again. Look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Very much.
Bye-bye.